back to the Spoken Word. My name is Travis, and I'm your host. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at giants in the Bible. Who were they? What were they like? Where did they come from? And how do they fit into the overall biblical narrative? Let's put together what we can from a number of texts in the Old Testament and see if we can piece together some part of the mystery of the giants. Okay, let's talk about biblical giants. Last time we saw that everyone in Israel collectively lost their minds at the mere mention of the Anakim, giants who were somehow associated with the enigmatic Nephilim mentioned in Genesis chapter 6. Most material from the cultures of the ancient Near East that surrounded Israel placed giants as either semi-divine or somehow having special favor from the gods. Gilgamesh, for example, is described in Mesopotamian literature as 2/3 divine, and he is also described as a giant. He was said to stand about 16 to 17 feet tall. So in line with those kinds of ancient Near Eastern thoughts, the Israelites at the gates of the Promised Land believed that the giants that they encountered were also near invincible, somehow otherworldly or superhuman adversaries. But was all of that just a product of their imaginations? Let's flesh these giants out and see if they really, measure up to their reputation. We're going to investigate two giants specifically, Goliath of Gath and King Og of Bashan. These are the only two giants that the Bible really gives any hard data on, things like measurements, size, things like that. But to start, we need to lay down a couple of terms that relate to these two giants. Those terms are Rephaim and Anakim. First up is the term Rephaim. Rephaim is a frustrating term because it is used in two distinct ways regarding giants. First, it is used as a clan name. So King Og of Bashan is said to be the, quote, last of the Rephaim. So he was the last of his clan or the last of his kind. That's simple enough, but other giant clans, namely the Emim, the Zamzummim, and the Anakim, are all said to, quote, count as Rephaim. Now this is interesting because the Anakim, who themselves, quote, counted as Rephaim, were alive and well when Og was called, quote, the last of the Rephaim. So it would seem that when applied to other clans like the Anakim, the term Rephaim is describing a type of being, not simply a clan. So Rephaim, in the clan sense, like Og, seem to function as the archetypal giant, the standard by which all other giants are measured. In a very real sense, Og seems to have been the OG biblical giant. Next, we have the Anakim. The Anakim were said to be the, quote, sons of Anak. Now, that could mean that they are descendants of this individual Anak, but the term sons of can also refer to those who would follow in someone else's footsteps or would be like them in some way. We see things like angels being called the sons of God. That doesn't mean that God was literally biologically their father. It means that they had some subordinate relationship, but reflection of God. Or there are places where prophets in training are called the sons of the prophets. Again, it doesn't mean biological descent. It simply means that those who are under authority of or in some way like the archetype of their class. So the Anakim are the sons of Anak, whether that means biologically or whether that means in some other relational way. But these are giants, and these are the creatures that Joshua, Caleb, and the 10 other spies encounter during their scouting mission in the land of Canaan. There are a few Anakim that are named in the book of Numbers, but we are not given any data on their physical appearance other than the fact that they were very tall. But we can guess what they were like because I believe that Goliath himself was an Anakim. His brother, Lami, was said to be a descendant of the, quote, Rapha, either meaning the Rephaim clan or the Rephaim class of Gath. Given that Og was the last of the Rephaim in the clan sense, and he was long dead by the time of Goliath and his brother Lami, I think that this Rapha term is a class denotation, much like saying the giant of Gath. So if that is true, then Goliath and Lami trace their lineage to this unnamed giant of Gath. The Bible only notes one clan of giants living in Gath by this point of the biblical story, and those giants are remnants of the Anakim. So, by deduction, this giant of Gath was likely himself an Anakim, and therefore Goliath and his brother, who were descended from this individual, were also Anakim. So if we want to know what Anakim might have been like in Moses' day, we need look no further than Goliath and his kin. So there we have our terms of Rephaim and Anakim and their representative individuals. Og, the last Rephaim and the king of Bashan, and Goliath, the ferocious Anakim of Gath. Let's take a careful look at both of these individuals, starting with Goliath. We meet Goliath in 1 Samuel chapter 17, set many years after Moses' day. The author of 1 Samuel gives us some details about Goliath's stature and his equipment. Let's talk first about his equipment because there is some debate about his height. So let's start with his body armor. His body armor alone weighed 125 pounds. For comparison, a Roman soldier's armor weighed in at about 25 pounds. 5 times less. A modern soldier might wear up to about 35 pounds in body armor. And even a full suit of medieval battle armor, which would cover a soldier from head to toe, weighed only about 60 pounds at most. Even tournament plating, which was this incredibly heavy, bulky armor that was meant to withstand jousting and therefore couldn't be worn in normal combat due to the bulk, weighed 80 pounds at most. So Goliath was running around in absurdly heavy armor. He was preparing to do fine hand-to-hand combat in body armor that was 56% heavier than an entire suit of immobilizing medieval tournament armor. That level of strength alone makes Goliath something totally superhuman at a minimum. Now, some people might say that Goliath was wearing ceremonial armor that was not meant to be practical. But, clever as that might sound on the History Channel, spine-crushing ceremonial armor is a category of armor that just does not exist. We have 0 artifacts anywhere in the world suggesting that anyone made 125-pound body armor just to wear to intimidate someone. The fact that Goliath could function with this kind of armor tells us that he was either a genetically augmented super soldier right out of science fiction, or he was something almost inhuman altogether. Next, the author of 1 Samuel tells us a few things about Goliath's spear. The tip of Goliath's spear alone weighed 15 pounds. Now, that may not seem that heavy, but comparable ancient spearheads, like the spearhead of the Roman pilum or the Greek dory, weighed in at about 1 to 2 pounds. Bear in mind that ancient combat spears were meant to be wielded with a single hand, and they would have included a shaft and a counterweight to balance the spear. So depending on where Goliath's spear was meant to be held, his spear might have weighed more than 30 pounds. His spear's shaft is also said to be as thick as a weaver's beam, or about 2.5 inches. A Roman pilum's spear shaft was about 0.75 inches, about 3/4 of an inch. A Greek dory's shaft was about 1.25 or 1.25 inches. If you take the average of the Roman and the Greek shaft diameters, you're looking at a spear shaft diameter falling somewhere around 1 inch across. That's about as thick as a typical broomstick. By contrast, Goliath's spear shaft would have been about as thick as a soda can. We don't know how long this spear was. Most spears used for one-on-one combat were about 6 to 7 feet long. Goliath's may have been even longer than that. So imagine a spear with a shaft as thick as a Coke can, at least 7 feet in length, tipped with a spearhead as heavy as a sledgehammer's head, with enough mass at the butt end of the spear to counterbalance it, and then try wielding that with one hand with enough grip to not get it immediately swatted out of your hand when someone hits it with a sword. This just was not a weapon designed for human hands. This was for a being of inhuman strength. Now that we know the inhuman scale of what Goliath carried into battle, just how tall was Goliath? This is where it gets a little bit messy. The Dead Sea Scrolls and Septuagint say that he was 4 cubits and a span tall. Put into imperial units, that's about 6 foot 9 inches. The Masoretic text says that he was 6 cubits and a span, or 9 feet 9 inches, not 6 feet 9 inches. So let's compare those numbers to some particularly tall humans. The average NBA player is 6 foot 6 inches. The tallest human on record is Mr. Robert Wadlow, who is also known as the Altan Giant. He came in at a staggering 8 feet and 11.1 inches. He had a medical condition called gigantism, where the pituitary gland in his brain made far more growth hormone than normal when he was a boy. The trouble with gigantism is that people that suffer from it are exceptionally weak. Their condition makes their bones grow out of proportion to their muscles, so they have a very mechanically inefficient skeleton. Mr. Wadlow had to walk with the assistance of leg braces, for example. He died at the very young age of 22 due to an infection from those braces, in fact. So, despite their height, no one with gigantism would be fit to fight in brutal hand-to-hand ancient combat. Based on what we know of the biomechanics of the human skeleton and performance in hand-to-hand combat like martial arts, the practical upper limit for height and weight in intense hand-to-hand combat is around 6 foot 11 inches and about 350 pounds. There's a very good reason that the tallest MMA fighters in history have topped out at about 7 foot 2 inches. So, based on real-world athletes who participate in high-impact sports similar to ancient hand-to-hand combat, we're looking at someone who is less than 7 feet tall and around 350 pounds at most to be a large but also successful warrior. That fits with the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls' shorter Goliath at 6 foot 9 inches. But here's the rub. A 6 foot 9 inch Goliath could not wear Goliath's 125 pound armor. As a general rule of thumb, young, fit humans can carry about 1/3 of their body weight across their shoulders for extended periods of time without getting injuries. At 6 foot 9 inches, Goliath would have weighed somewhere around 260 pounds, assuming a muscular athlete's build. This means his armor alone would have been almost half of his body weight, far more than was safe to bear, much less fight in. He would have needed to be taller and heavier to bear this kind of weight. A more recent analog might be Agnes McCaskill, the world's tallest true giant, meaning he did not have a condition like gigantism. He stood at 7 foot 9 inches and weighed 425 pounds at his peak. He did enormous feats of strength like carrying a 190-pound man in a rescue carry over 25 miles to see a doctor. For someone like him, 125 pounds of battle armor might have fallen in a safe range. But McCaskill was a foot taller than the shorter Goliath of the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he weighed much more because weight scales exponentially with height. But while strong, Agnes was not a fighter. If you look across combat sports like MMA, boxing, and the like, the best performers are under 7 feet tall. This is simply due to the mechanical reasons that we discussed earlier. Humans over that height start losing mechanical efficiency, making them slower and less coordinated. Goliath was obviously not an easy opponent to take down because he was a, quote, champion. The Hebrew term that we translate as champion more literally means that Goliath was a man of the space between, meaning that he was a duelist that would fight in single combat between two opposing armies, just like he does in 1 Samuel 17, where he calls across to the Israelite battle lines and challenges them to send a single champion to come and meet him, where the two of them could duke it out on behalf of their two armies. So somehow, we have to resolve this problem. We need Goliath to be big enough to handle his equipment, but he also needs to retain the speed and the efficiency in combat of a much shorter man. You can't have both with a typical 6'9" tall human. The other issue is that a 6'9" Goliath wouldn't have been all that scary. Saul, who was Israel's king at the time, stood, quote, head and shoulders taller than anyone in Israel. The average late Bronze Age Semitic male, who would have been representative of your typical Canaanite or Israelite, stood at about 5'4". So Saul, being head and shoulders above someone who was 5'4", easily stood at least 6 feet tall himself. And yet, despite that, Goliath somehow even left the mighty Saul cowering in his tent. If Goliath were only 6'9" and Saul was nearly that height himself, what was he so afraid of? So we're left with a couple of conclusions. First, we could say that a 6'9" Goliath is too small to wear and wield his own equipment if he were a normal human. You could say that even at this height, his strength indicates a superhuman physiology. But even with that strength, he's too small to really have the kind of intimidation factor that he seemed to have had, in my estimation. On the other hand, the 9'9" Goliath of the Masoretic text is far too tall to be a normal human. But these proportions make his armor and weaponry more to scale. It also gives him the intimidation factor that the 6'9" Goliath lacks. So my conclusion? Between these two, I think that the Masoretic text has the measurement right. Goliath was a 9'9", either superhuman or non-human entity. While both of these heights fit the ancient picture of giants being semi-divine or specially favored individuals, whether by superhuman strength or by superhuman strength and stature, I think the taller Goliath simply makes the most sense. So let's think about this inhuman 9'9" creature, this Anakim warrior. If you isometrically scale an average 154-pound, 5'9", average American male, proportionally up to 9 feet 9 inches, Goliath would weigh about 750 pounds. If we assume a more robust build like a modern strongman with a BMI of 45 or something like that, Goliath could have weighed about 875 pounds. If we make his skeleton more robust to handle combat strain and all of his weight, he might be, say, 10% heavier, or about 960 pounds. If you add on his armor and weaponry on top of that, you're looking at over a half a ton of muscle, metal, and malice. Now, if that kind of Goliath is what the army of Israel was facing down in 1 Samuel 17, I can understand why nobody, including Saul, wanted to face him. And if Goliath was anything like an average Anakim, I can understand why almost everyone in Israel collectively lost their minds when they learned they'd have to fight a whole land full of Goliaths. It also explains why Joshua and Caleb were banking on Yahweh's intervention to defeat these entities. Everyone knew that it would take a miracle to defeat these things, but only Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb thought that Yahweh would actually intervene and bring them victory. So that's our window into the Anakim courtesy of Goliath. Now let's turn to our second giant, King Og of Bashan, the Rephaim, a member of the clan of giants by which all others in Canaan were measured. Deuteronomy 3:11 says this, Og, king of Bashan, was the last of the Rephaim. His bed was decorated with iron and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. These measurements make the bed over 13.5 feet long and over 6 feet wide. Apparently, it was remarkable enough that they stuck it in a museum in Rabbah. This fact is actually confirmed by the writer Josephus, who lived in the 1st century AD, about 1,500 years later. He said that it was still an artifact that you could see in his day. The point of all these measurements was, if this was the guy's bed, then imagine how tall Og was. So let's do just that. Most modern beds are about 5 to 10 inches longer than the average person is tall. So let's widen the range and say that Og's bed was maybe 6 to 12 inches longer than he was, for argument's sake. This would make him 12 foot 6 inches on the lower end, or 13 feet tall on the higher end. If you use our strongman plus extra bone mass calculation from earlier, Og would have weighed at least 1,580 pounds, not including armor and armaments. So let's do one further bit of speculation. If we say that the Anakim that were seen by the spies of Israel were something like Goliath on average, with something like Og being on the upper end of the bell curve of their race, say the 95th percentile, then if you do all of the statistical analysis of that, you're looking at a population where most of these Anakim stood between 8 feet and 11.5 feet tall, with the shortest Anakim still being 6 foot 6 inches. So Goliath, who was our example Anakim, and Og, our example Rephaim, had totally inhuman proportions. They're a lot easier to explain if they're either superhumans or aren't even human and are something else altogether. And fortunately for us, that's exactly how the Bible treats giants. We'll talk about the origins of giants in the next episode. But for now, just remember that when you see a giant in the Bible, you're dealing with something that goes far beyond being a normal human. You're dealing with a real-life monster. With that, thank you so much for listening, and God bless.